Joining us now from Tehran is Seyed Mohammad Marandi. He is the Dean of the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran. Dr. Marandi, thanks for joining us. What's been the reaction in Iran to the speech made by the Israeli leader to the US Congress?
I don't think anyone really took him seriously. There was a lot of nonsense in the speech, and the Iranians by now are almost all well versed in the history of the Iranian peaceful nuclear program. So I think that the expectations were basically knowing Netanyahu for what he is, that he would make some outlandish claims and twist the truth, and that would be it basically.
Now, some of the criticism of Iran by the Israeli Prime Minister was very harsh. The language was very pointed. Let's take a listen to some of what he had to say.
If anyone thinks this deal kicks the can down the road, think again. When we get down that road, we'll face a much more dangerous Iran, a Middle East littered with nuclear bombs, and a countdown to a potential nuclear nightmare.
So there we have Benjamin Netanyahu saying that Iran could drag the world into a nuclear nightmare. That is an extremely serious accusation. What did you make of it?
Well, coming from the head of a regime that actually possesses nuclear weapons and currently occupies territory belonging to Lebanon, Syria, Saudi Arabia, 2 islands, and of course occupied Palestine territory. Even according to UN resolutions, those territories are occupied. And a country that has carried out a host of military activities against its neighboring countries unprovoked. And of course the slaughter in Gaza that we saw just a few months ago, I really don't think anyone here takes him seriously. The Iranians, on the other hand, have never initiated a war over the last 200 to 300 years. After the revolution, the only war that was carried out was a defensive war when Saddam Hussein invaded the country. And indeed, when Saddam used chemical weapons provided to him by the West, by the way, the Iranians never retaliated. They never attempted to produce or use chemical weapons, which shows that the Iranians basically have a clean record. Indeed, Iranian religious leaders have given fatwas against weapons of mass destruction, and that is why during the Iran-Iraq war they were not used. So if when one sees the evidence and puts aside the rhetoric, it's really the Israeli regime that is the cause of instability. And the Iranian opposition to Israel is based upon the fact that it's an apartheid regime. Iran believes that it is illegitimate to have a racist apartheid regime, and it believes that apartheid must be dismantled, just like it was dismantled in apartheid South Africa. That's basically the Iranian argument.
This speech, we are told, was meant to undermine the current talks taking place between the P5+1, that's the 4 permanent members of the UN Security Council, as well as Germany, taking place with Iran on securing a nuclear deal. What kind of impact will this speech have on those negotiations?
Well, it's hard to say, but in the past, the Israeli regime has had a very negative influence on US-Iranian relations. And basically what the Israeli regime is trying to do is to keep the region full of tension. The Iranians have been saying all along that, for many years now actually, that they are willing to strike a deal with the United States and the P5+1 to resolve the nuclear dossier. The IAEA has never provided any information to show that Iran's nuclear program is anything but peaceful. And in 2012, when this very same Israeli Prime Minister gave a speech at the UN General Assembly and claimed that Iran was on the verge of producing a nuclear weapon, we now know, according to leaked documents, Mossad was saying that at that time that Iran's nuclear program is basically following a peaceful pattern and all of its activities are legitimate. These documents have just been released these documents that were sent to South Africa, the South African intelligence, were just released a couple of weeks ago. So we know that he was lying then, and I think it's quite clear that he's not being honest now either. So he is attempting to create problems at the negotiating table, but I think the Americans recognize that they need to improve relations with Iran much more today than ever before because of the enormous instability in the region, largely thanks to America's alliance with Wahhabi regimes that have led to the rise of extremism. America's confrontation with Russia and China has really made the American current position unsustainable. So the Iranians recognize that the Americans need a deal.
What happens if there's no deal?
Well, there are different scenarios. There could be an extension of the talks, and there could be sort of mini deals along the way. But I think that at the end of the day, if the United States fails to recognize Iran's rights within the framework of international law and fails to agree to remove all sanctions, then Iran would have no option but to go back to business as usual. And that would mean developing its peaceful nuclear program without taking into consideration any fears that the United States may have or concerns that it may have. And the Iranians will move on to new partners. Already the Russians, being sanctioned by the United States, have made strong moves towards Iran, and I think China too is becoming increasingly concerned that Western countries are sanctioning one partner after another of the Chinese government. So the Chinese, the Iranians, the Russians, and others will be looking for alternative mechanisms for trade outside the current Western-dominated system. And I think that though the future would be difficult for Iran, in the long term, it is the West that will lose out the most, because an alternative economic trade system would mean would have serious consequences for Western domination in this area.
Now, Israel has threatened Iran with an attack on several occasions because, according to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other leaders, Iran poses what the Prime Minister says is an existential threat to Israel. Does Iran fear an Israeli attack?
Well, this is one of the interesting things. In the West, they regularly say that Iran has threatened Israel with annihilation, which is completely untrue. It's a willful mistranslation of what Iranian leaders have said repeatedly. And what they have said is that Israel must cease to exist as a political entity because it's an apartheid state. That's essentially what the Iranians have been saying all along and repeatedly. But on the other hand, the Israelis have repeatedly threatened Iran with military strikes. So this is the irony. Israel does threaten Iran, yet Iran in the Western media is the side that's accused of being aggressive.
Dr. Marandi, we're going to have to leave it there, sir. Thanks for joining us.